Hey everyone, it's Andrew. Welcome back to my channel, Everything Books, where we talk about everything books. Today we're going to be discussing the book, The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. I recently read this book over the past 3 weekends and I just finished it, so I wanted to do a review and synopsis of this book while it's fresh on my mind, so for those of you that are watching this can get either more insight into the book or determine whether you want to read it yourself. So we'll just get started. So this book, as I said, is by Alexandre Dumas. Many of you have heard the story of the Three Musketeers through different film or movie adaptations of this because it's very popular. When I looked it up previously, there's probably been about 4 or 5 different editions of the movie from this book, and all of them have their little nuances, but all of it really revolves around this story in this book. And so I think it's important for those of you that have watched those movies to essentially at some point read the book so you get a general understanding of how Alexandre Dumas presented the story and a general understanding of what the initial story was about, because the movies do vary from one copy to the other, and are significantly adapted from this book. As far as a general synopsis of things, this book is really a historical fiction around the time period of like Louis XIV, and so it focuses on the historical nature of that, but the rest of the story is fiction and revolves around the Three Musketeers and D'Artagnan, as many of you know. And so the story as it starts out is essentially D'Artagnan leaving his home, leaving his father who lives with his father's sword, some money, and then a letter written by his father to leave and go to Paris to join the Musketeers. He's going to leave his home and meet with Monsieur de Treville, who is the captain of the Musketeers, and ask him whether he can join and figure out how to do that. So his father wrote a letter on his behalf for that. And so he leaves his home, and on his journey to go to Paris, he comes across a town called Ming, or M-E-U-N-G, and that chapter really focuses on the man of Ming, or Monsieur de Ming, who essentially is this nobleman that D'Artagnan has a confrontation with, and resulting from that, essentially this nobleman steals the letter, or takes the letter that his father wrote for him, and D'Artagnan, kind of in the back of his mind, always wants to seek revenge against him, but can't at that time. So in this back of his mind, throughout the entire story, he always wants to find this man and get back at him for stealing this letter. Simultaneously, this man or nobleman is accompanied by this lady who is referred to different names throughout the book, but her name is Milady, or M.I. Lady, essentially. And she becomes a significant antagonist throughout the book, and when D'Artagnan first meets her, he's kind of like captivated by her, but he knows like something's mysterious about her. So he's always like, who is this lady? I want to know more. And she develops into a bigger character later on. And so that's the initial backdrop of the book, as far as how it starts out. And then D'Artagnan ultimately goes to Paris, knowing that he doesn't have this letter, and goes to Monsieur de Treville, who's the captain of the Musketeers. And the Musketeers are responsible for guarding the king, so it's like the king's guard. And he reaches out to him and says, I don't have this letter that my dad wrote for me, but I want to join the Musketeers. And Monsieur de Treville says, you can't really join because you don't have a reputation, or like you haven't proven yourself in adventure and being like in swordship and stuff like that. And so you have to go and join either a lower guard of some form or military group to prove yourself before you can apply and become a musketeer. So D'Artagnan chooses to leave, and on his way from going from Monsieur de Treville, he comes across the Three Musketeers. The Three Musketeers being Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. And Athos, Porthos, and Aramis are close friends, and they're this triad of musketeers that essentially are the entire storyline regarding the musketeers. But through 3 separate interactions with them, ultimately D'Artagnan challenges each of them to a duel at separate locations on the same day at different times. When he ultimately shows up for the first duel, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, being friends, show up simultaneously, because at that time period, for duels, you had to bring somebody else that could essentially prove that you established your honor and were honorable throughout the duel, so that you don't do anything malicious or of like inappropriately, essentially. So when he shows up for the first duel, the Three Musketeers are like, "Hey, I have a duel with this guy later today. Why are you dueling him?" And D'Artagnan essentially says, "I have a duel with all three of you, and I'll duel you, then you, then you," essentially. And while this is happening, the Cardinal's guards, the Cardinal being like the religious political power at the time period, who is trying to establish power in sync with the king and trying to gain power over the king, who is like a significant antagonist as well in the book. His guards essentially who come across this situation, and they've previously had issues with the Three Musketeers, and they say, "You can't duel, it's against the law, and we're going to arrest you." And there's 5 Cardinals guards, and there's only 3 of the Three Musketeers, and then there's D'Artagnan just sitting around, and the Three Musketeers are like, "We'll accept this, don't arrest us, and we'll fight you." And D'Artagnan chooses to join forces with the Three Musketeers, and ultimately they beat the 5 of the Cardinals guards, and that's how they come together, despite the fact that they were challenging each other in duels. And from there, the storyline really takes off as far as the different adventures and the situation and the rest of the book. I'm not going to go into too much detail beyond that because I don't want to spoil it for you. But from there, there's essentially 3 separate portions of the book. The first portion is really, there's the situation with the queen, who is Anne of Austria, who is from like the Spanish Empire, who married the French king. And she essentially puts D'Artagnan on this mission, and all 3 Musketeers, plus their lackeys or servants at the time, go off on this kind of like long journey or adventure related to that. And there's things like that, like every single chapter has its little nuances or a segment of that story. And so that's one portion of the story. The second part of it is following that, there's, it ultimately leads to the situation where the England and France go to war. And so the Musketeers, being the king's guard, are required to go to war as well. And so they go off to war, do that aspect as well. And then the last segment, which is the third part, is really about this lady, my lady, who it gives more context and background about her story, how she contributes to it, and ultimately is like the end segment of the book. So that's like the general theme overall, like throughout the book. I'll say now my impressions of the book. So me coming into this, I really came in not really knowing much about the book itself, but really the movie adaptations of it, and knowing like the Three Musketeers and D'Artagnan, and that it's revolving around France and the Cardinal and things like that. I knew that essence of it, but I didn't know the whole premise behind it. And so I didn't know what I was coming into this. I kind of thought this was going to be more of a serious book, something kind of in the realm of like Lord of the Rings seriousness, where there's not really like joking or comedic aspect of it. But this is really, as I would describe it, is more of like a satirical book or comedic book. There's a lot more humor than you would anticipate. I would describe it as like a mix of like Don Quixote with Monty Python and the Holy Grail to a certain extent, because it's very humorous. Each of the Three Musketeers plus D'Artagnan have their own personalities. Like Athos like has this background of being a noble, and there's this whole realm of story behind that. Porthos is just kind of like this like overly confident, cocky guy that runs into situations based on his personality. And then Aramis is like aspiring to go back into becoming a priest eventually, so there's a whole story revolving around that. And their personalities, because they have their own like character flaws and their strong personality of who they are, puts them in these weird situations that lead to that first part of the book that I was talking about with the journey and adventure, and contributes to that storyline. The other component is, unlike the movies, I've only seen a couple of versions of it, is all of them have their own servants or lackeys, and so that's why it kind of reminds me of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where they all have their own like squires. And they're not like main characters in the book, but they do provide this ancillary like secondary role that supports the storyline, and they all have their own nuances there, where a lot of the adventures revolve that pairing of like one of the musketeers plus their lackey going off and doing a task. And so there's a component of that you wouldn't really know like just watching the movies. So there's that. The other thing I was always worried about with reading this is, one, it's 700 pages long. I typically only read like 200 to 300 page books, because on the weekend I'll read like a book in one weekend and then move on to the next book. But a book like this, typically in my past, I would like pick up something like this, read like like halfway through, get busy with life, put it down, and never come back to it. However, for this book, it was pretty easy to pick up and then read the rest of it. So I read it in general in 3 weekends, which was a nice accomplishment, because now I know, hey, I can read something like this and be able to pick it up again and move forward. So it opens me to much longer books and doing that on a regular basis, which is nice. But I also anticipated that being written in 1844 in French and then translated to English, I thought it was going to be a more like difficult read as far as like the text and making it harder to read in general, and it was going to drag on, which it wasn't that case at all. Like, for instance, this Barnes & Noble edition, I think it's like Barbara Cooper, she translates this and it's a very easy read. Overall, the structure is kind of weird though. Like, I would describe it as like Dumas writes the majority of the storyline really is actually the dialogue between the characters. So it moves on throughout the entire book, mainly primarily through dialogue. And then there's segments where there is like classic prose or narration, where you'll have segments of chapters or writing without dialogue. But that's primarily used to kind of move the story along. So when they go to war, it provides details as far as the historical context. Like, it provides a summary of different events that happen between the two segments of the story. However, it doesn't really rely on narration to move it along. It's really that dialogue. So that's a little bit different. It did make it a little bit longer because I tend to like sub-vocalize when reading that. However, it's just a different way of writing, a different way of moving a story along. So that's one nuance to this as well. But that's what I'll say as well. And then beyond that, I don't want to allude to too much just because I don't want to ruin it for you. But this My Lady context as well. She's a significant person in the story, but a lot of that is probably contributes to this like feminism role and like the context of like how women are viewed in society at that time. I'm not going to allude to it too much because you really you have to read the book to gain a better understanding of what I'm really referring to. But if I go into too much detail, it's just kind of ruin it for you. But there's a certain component of that as well that you have to kind of take as you read this as well. So that's really all I have. So in general, I would say that Three Musketeers definitely worth the time, especially because there's so many different adaptations and movies from this book. Alexandre Dumas, following this book, also wrote 20 years later, essentially, which follows up on the story of the Three Musketeers 20 years later. Reviews online essentially say that that book is better than this one to a certain extent. I haven't read it yet, but I will be reading it once I get my hands on a copy. There's also a copy, following that, there's also the story of The Man in the Iron Mask that was also made into a movie, and has different adaptations in film and TV and stuff like that. But that's a second book from this. And then when I was looking online, there's also another book called The Red Sphinx, which is another book. So there's 3 other books from this. The two, like the 20 years after and The Man in the Iron Mask, plus this are referred to as like the D'Artagnan romances. And so if you read this, you could always follow it up with those books as well. And so there is a general path of reading multiple books from this. So I don't know. That's really all I have for this. So I highly recommend the book. I didn't think it was the greatest. I didn't think it was worse, but it was definitely worth the time. It wasn't something that I like hated reading. I didn't feel like it dragged on too much. The last part where it's like more about My Lady, it was nice because they transitioned more to narration to pass on the story. And that like pace picked up drastically. Like I read that really, really quickly. However, the rest of the book, it was slow at times just because it was primarily dialogue. And so that's kind of all I have. So if you have questions, comments about this book, if you have different thoughts on it, definitely post them below. If you like this video, definitely like it, and please subscribe if you're interested in following more on my book reviews. This channel will really focus on book reviews from now on, now that I've branched out and made this as an individual channel. And then the only other thing I'll say is, beyond the D'Artagnan romances, what my next thing is, I'm probably going to go back and read The Count de Monte Cristo. So this is Alexandre Dumas's other book that really focuses on a whole separate storyline, which is a great book, but this is like 1,200 pages. I read it partially in French and English way back in high school, but I never read the book in its entirety. So what I'm going to plan on doing over the next month or so is read this, and then I'll follow up with doing a review on this as well. So you can definitely subscribe and check that out when it's posted as well. So thanks for watching, and if you have questions, comments, please post them, and please subscribe.